40-year-old store clerk Conbino Crasto, known as Bino to his friends, is busy at work.
Hey, Bino.
Hey, Dale, how are you?
Surviving.
I've known Bino since 2010. We got acquainted at the convenience store.
So, how are things in India?
Oh, good. Let me show you.
He was from the state of Goa, near the southern end of India. His main mission in life was to take care of his family there.
That's pretty good.
These are my boys.
Yeah,
He had a wife and 2 sons in India.
That's my youngest boy.
He would work here and send money home. Bino was devoted to his family and was excited about going back.
Hey, Sam.
How are you?
Oh, good.
I met him at the gas station. We started talking like we knew each other for years. You walk in, he had a smile on your face. His smile made you smile.
Thank you.
Bino was more than just a clerk. He was kind of the caretaker of that area where people needed something. Bino would help. He was such a caring, compassionate individual.
I think most of Cleveland became his chosen family. Regardless if he wanted us or not, we were going to be his family.
Hello, ma'am. This one attacked the store. Send somebody.
Okay, the Cleveland market?
They stolen all the money. They shoot, I think. They shot him.
They shot at you?
Yeah. Please
Bring the ambulance to that location.
send the ambulance. He's dying, ma'am.
That was a routine patrol. When the 911 call came through, a male who was shot at a local convenience store. Right on location.
Police department.
I observed a male standing behind the cash register area and another male lying on the ground, holding onto his chest.
The wounded man is the store's clerk, Conbino Crasto.
I tried my best to apply pressure over the wound. He was saying, I'm dying, I do not want to die. I have a family, I do not want to die.
EMS rushes Conbino to the hospital, while Detective Kevin Cook takes over the investigation.
When I arrived at the scene, I met with Sergeant Potter. We conducted a walkthrough of the scene to get a look at any potential evidence. There was a 9mm shell casing on the floor and bloodstains behind the counter. My first impression was that it was an aggravated robbery. When I met with Adelino Fernandez, the store clerk witness in one of the patrol vehicles.
I'm Detective Cook with the police department. Can you tell me what happened here tonight?
He was visibly upset and crying, and he appeared to be very scared.
We in this one both are discussing the bill on in this one register.
He told me that he was working in the store with Conbino Crasto. Both the store clerks were behind the counter.
Suddenly, one man came with mask and gun. So he said, give money.
One man by himself?
Yeah.
And he had a mask on?
Yeah, mask on. He came alone and the back there is another two with mask.
Very shortly after, 2 more masked subjects were observed entering the store.
Given the first, he came, he said, give the money, otherwise I'll shoot you. He throws something. He just in center, go, he said. So then he shoot him. He cry and he fall down.
stated that the subject threw the backpack at Gambino Crasto, and it was at the time that he threw the backpack, the suspect fired one shot.
Okay, and did the robber come around the counter and get the money?
Yeah, he came inside and he taken all the money. Told them, don't kill me, please, please, don't kill me, I beg him. And they walk away, not run.
I didn't have any information other than 3 masked males. My next step is to gain access to any surveillance video in the store.
There was a video surveillance camera behind the register and one in the lobby area, but we had no idea if it was actually functioning properly.
We have got to get that video, and we've got to get access to it as soon as possible.
The only one who was able to log into the system was the owner of the establishment. He was not on location. The next step is notify him as quickly as possible and have him en route.
While they wait for the store's manager, investigators search the exterior of the building.
We observed several coins on the front sidewalk of the store, just east of the store entrance. We followed the coin trail to the corner of the building, across the parking lot, across a ditch. The coin trail that led along the road to a point where we found a blue bandana laying on the road. That was collected as potential evidence. The coin trail definitely gave us an idea of a direction of travel. We knew that the suspects were traveling east, and there's a large neighborhood nearby. The coin trail led straight to the neighborhood. It was important to begin searching that neighborhood for anyone matching the description of the suspects and any potential home surveillance cameras.
While Conbino fights for his life in the hospital, the store manager arrives on scene and grants officers access to the CCTV.
We began the search of the archives approximately 5 minutes before the call came in to the police department.
Show me the inside camera.
I'm hoping to get a glimpse of one of the suspects' faces to help identify them. We started with the camera fixated on the front door. At 9:20 p.m., you see the suspect enter the store.
Freeze it there.
He's wearing a black jacket, tan pants, carrying a backpack and a handgun. He's wearing distinctive latex gloves, wearing a blue bandana with a hoodie. So he's done a good job of concealing his identity.
Keep playing it.
A short time later, the second suspect walks in. He's wearing a gray hoodie, gray pants. He's also wearing a bandana over his face. We located one bandana on the roadway on the north side of the park, so that led us to believe that that bandana had been worn by one of the suspects. The third suspect, who is shorter in stature, is wearing gloves and a ski mask and a distinctive black and white checkered long sleeve shirt.
Okay, show me the right camera behind the camera.
The armed suspect has approached the front counter, and he's pointing his firearm at Mr. Crasto, and he's tossing a black backpack to Mr. Crasto.
Let's switch to the wider angle. Play that again.
Mr. Crasto takes the bag and essentially has his hands up and he's walking backwards. At that point, he was shot by the gunman. Cambino Crasto is lying on the floor bleeding from a gunshot wound to the chest. He was not putting up any fight. He was not resisting the suspects in any way. It tells you that this gunman is reckless and he has no regard for human life. You see the store clerk witness go to the corner behind the counter and cower down.
He just witnessed his fellow employee get shot. He's probably in a state of shock. He starts complying and reaching into cash register.
The gunman, you see him run behind the counter. The other two suspects stand in front of the counter. The taller of the three suspects in the gray hoodie with the purple stripes stands at the counter and is helping the gunman gather the money. Once the gunman gets the money from the register, he's observed running around the counter and essentially stepping over Mr. Crasto, and all three suspects are seen running out of the store.
Show me the outside camera.
And then running east along the sidewalk, which was consistent with the money trail that we saw.
Now you have three suspects. You know that one of them has a firearm and he's ready to use that firearm.
That's a dangerous person to just shoot someone that's unarmed and for no reason. We went back through the surveillance video to see if we can see anything that's helpful to identify the suspects.
Play that again. Freeze it there.
The suspect is wearing black shoes with distinctive red shoelaces, which are something that stands out. They're different.
Look at that.
The gloves, the color of the gloves is distinctive.
Keep playing it. No gloves.
Suspect number 2 is not wearing any gloves. So we were able to identify suspect number 2 as a white male, tall, thin white male. We were able to get a good, accurate description of the suspects. That information was broadcast out to the officers in the field.
The hospital treating Conbino calls Detective Cook.
Go for Cook.
I was notified Mr. Crasto had passed away at the hospital. That now ramps the investigation up to capital murder.
Okay, I'll let everyone know.
He was just trying to make a living to provide for him and his family. I mean, what a heinous crime for a couple $100.
Now let's get to work.
Time is of the essence. It's important to try to locate these suspects as soon as possible.
My direction was to get as many officers in the areas as we could to prevent the escape of these individuals.
The coin trail led straight to the neighborhood known as Englewood. Several officers began canvassing that neighborhood, looking for any evidence or suspects. They're looking for the surveillance cameras along the eaves of the houses. Those are beneficial in capturing a direction of travel or possible suspect vehicle. Approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, we're notified by a Liberty County deputy that He has located a surveillance video on a residence on Jenny Street. He has had an opportunity to review the surveillance video from the resident.
Can you take it back to about 9 o'clock last night?
You're just scanning through it to see if you pick up any vehicles driving by or, you know, anybody walking by.
Whoa. Can you replay that?
He had located a vehicle passed by that residence approximately 3 minutes after the time of the shooting.
He's right there.
The vehicle was a Chevrolet or GMC extended cab pickup, fairly old, but the unique thing about it was the suspension had been lowered and it didn't have aftermarket wheels on it. They were factory wheels. Although it is a black and white video, the way that the street light reflects off of the vehicle, you can tell that it's red in color. That was a unique truck that we could easily look for in the neighborhood.
Just gonna take a picture of this really quick.
And it puts that particular vehicle in the area at the time of the shooting, so it's definitely a vehicle of interest.
As dawn breaks, officers step up their search.
At this point, we're looking for the red truck that was seen on the residential surveillance video.
Yeah.
I got a call from my partner. He had located a red extended cab pickup with lowered suspension parked in the front yard of a residence there. The vehicle was located probably 6 to 8 blocks from the store. It was obviously the same truck on the video. Just glanced around the bed of the truck and I saw loose change and the distinctive latex gloves. Also saw the gray hoodie with the purple stripes on it. I got excited and I said, man, that hoodie looks real familiar and those gloves are the same type of gloves we're looking for. There was definitely a chance that we could collect some DNA from those items. We made contact with the homeowner there.
Sir, we wanted to ask you, do you know anything about this truck?
He provided a lot of information. He stated that his wife's cousin, Robert Alvarado, was the owner of the vehicle. He had no knowledge that Robert Alvarado had parked that vehicle on his property, and he told us where Robert Alvarado was living.
As detectives head to Alvarado's home, officers break the news to Conbino's friends and family.
Hello? Yes.
One of the law enforcement officers called me and told me that there had been a robbery and a murder. And I asked him, I said, was it Bino? And he said, yes. My first thoughts was of his family and his children. What would they do now? His cousin called and let the family know what had happened. Think of them because none of us ever wanted to receive the telephone call.
As soon as I heard it, I just crumbled. How do you shoot somebody who's never done you wrong?
Detectives arrive at Robert Alvarado's residence.
He lived in a travel trailer. It was within eyesight of the store. And we make contact with Robert Alvarado and his father.
Can I ask you a few questions about it?
Sure. He'd seen what was going on at the store, which is like 200 yards away, and said that he went to that store all the time, and he knew all the clerks in there.
Okay, if we have a look inside. Go ahead, bro.
We didn't find any weapons or any of the clothing that would match the suspects in the video. Robert Alvarado was unusually nervous, so that raised our level of suspicion even more. So at that point, he was asked to come down to the police department for an interview.
This is completely voluntary, okay? You're not under arrest, you're not being detained for any reason, okay? And you're free to leave at any time. As a matter of fact, there's the door, okay?
We asked him about his vehicle.
Where is your truck? What kind of truck are we talking about? Where is it at?
It's a Ford.
What color is it?
Oh, red.
Red?
Yeah. And my dad needs to get the. He needs to get the. He's gonna fix it.
Stated that his vehicle was broke down, and his father was a mechanic, and the vehicle was at his father's shop getting worked on.
You're not being 100% because I got your truck. I got it. Okay? Your truck ain't never been down to your daddy's.
It was right
No,
there.
no.
Robert Alvarado's father told us Robert Alvarado brought his truck to his mechanic shop, had it fixed, and then picked it up later that day. So it contradicted what Robert Alvarado had told us.
Look, I got your pickup on video. Look, you know you and your boys run out of there, and you drop money like a breadcrumb trail all the way out. We found your truck. Okay, we got it. Over there in the neighborhood. There's evidence all in the truck of what went down. Right.
And it's in the truck.
Yeah.
He was confronted with the fact that we'd found the truck on Meadow Street, and then you really begin to see the physical indicators, the sweating and the stuttering.
I was not at the store. I was even over at the store, bro. That scene is not me. Believe me, that scene is not me. I don't know what the hell happened in that scene.
What do you mean this scene is not you?
Where were you?
At the trailer. At the trailer since 7 o'clock.
Look, bro.
That's the thing, the truck don't make sense.
Look, bro. I didn't do anything. I wasn't even at the store. I was at the house, bro.
He denies having any involvement in the shooting at the country market.
But that wasn't me, man, for real. Keep telling yourself.
The fact that he's lying about where his truck's at, it tells me we're on the right track.
Okay. Good luck to you. Right off.
It's not probable cause to arrest him. We still had to put him at the scene.
Members of the community gathered to pay tribute to Conbino following his murder.
It was extremely overwhelming. People who came through and just showed up, even if they didn't have anything to give or anything to offer, just to show up and say, hey, we're sorry. It was just an outpouring of the whole community.
Nino's death was difficult for us, but he and I were very close. But I never forget, there's probably 200 or 300 other people out there that's in my same boots. They were all close to him, so it wasn't exclusive for me, and I know it touched everybody.
Still photos of the suspects from the surveillance videos are being distributed through social media. The officers have received the photos on their phones.
We were hoping that, being a small community, that we would recognize the stature, the walk, the pace of these individuals.
One of the patrol officers thought he recognized one of the suspects in the photos based on his physical description. Tall, very skinny. He saw it, and he had dealt with him a few days before when he was involved in a disturbance involving a red pickup. And he gave us the address of where we could find Michael Richardson. My partner and I drove to Michael Richardson's residence. Michael Richardson was an 18-year-old young man, wasn't really on the radar of law enforcement.
Morning. My name is Detective Cook. This is Detective Shaver. Are you Mr. Michael Richardson?
Yeah.
We talked to him briefly and asked if he'd be willing to come down to the police department.
Yeah, sure. Let me grab a shirt.
So he walks to his back bedroom. My partner follows him back just to be safe. Michael Richardson was acting nervous after my partner observed some ammunition.
You got it? Take a look at this.
He's found a pair of black shoes with red shoelaces, a blue bandana that's consistent with what the suspect was wearing in the surveillance video. So at that point, Michael Richardson was transported down to Cleveland Police Department.
Why do you think you're here?
Because y'all know that I know someone that had something to do with it.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Because when Robert came to my house, he was wearing a black long sleeve shirt with a hoodie, and that's what they're wearing in that picture.
Okay. Robert who?
Alvarado.
Michael Richardson stated around 10 o'clock, Roberto Alvarado came back to his residence and asked him to hold some clothing.
Okay. And then he gave you what?
The shoes in the bag with a bandana.
A pair of black shoes with red laces, another pair of black boots, and a blue bandana. Those items of clothing were of interest to us because they matched the clothing in the surveillance video.
You have some more involvement than you're kind of laying out. You know that, and we know that.
Mm-hmm. Am I gonna get in trouble though?
Listen,
like
buddy.
if I just tell what happened?
We need to go get Robert before they hurt somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? You're the key to that.
Okay. Robert had come and got me, and then we went to that camper thing that he stays in. And he had this little gun and was pointing it around.
Let's go back a little bit to how when Robert came and picked you up at your house, what was he in? He
was in a red truck. Clock, and he started talking about doing some stupid crap about robbing the store. He started saying there's only one guy tonight. He said we would go up in there, no one would get hurt, we would be in and out. And then when we were in there, he was yelling at him, and then the one guy, he had grabbed the bag, the other guy that got shot, he grabbed the bag and was like slinging it at him. He was slinging it at him, and then he put it up against his, like this whenever he was trying to go to the bag, and then that's whenever Robert shot him.
He identifies Robert Alvarado as the shooter.
Investigators turned to the other suspect in the surveillance video.
Well, man, just speaking with us, you've helped us quite a bit. We got to figure out who the third guy is.
I don't know.
Okay.
When someone tells you a story, they're very detailed to a point, and then they get real vague, and it's suspicious. So, you know, it was important to find out who he associated with that could possibly be suspect number 3. Once Michael Richardson confesses, he is placed under arrest, and he is subsequently charged with capital murder.
Following Richardson's confession, detectives also arrest Robert Alvarado for capital murder.
At this point, we have 2 suspects in custody. That led to now concentrating on the third suspect with the gray and white plaid shirt and the black ski mask.
Investigators received tips of 2 people potentially connected to the shooting.
We received the name Cole Lincoln and Frank Hernandez as possible actors involved in the incident. Cole Lincoln arrived at the police department with his father. And I then conducted a voluntary interview with Cole Lincoln along with his parent.
I'm investigating a capital murder that occurred at a store here in town. Your name came up in the investigation. You know, there's a lot of finger pointing going on. I want to ask you, did you have any knowledge or any involvement in this robbery?
I might as well just straight up. Yes, I was there that night.
And you were part of the robbery?
Yes.
Were you?
Yes.
What were you wearing?
I was wearing a black ski mask.
To be honest with you, I wasn't expecting the confession right then, and I don't believe his father was expecting it.
The truth's gonna come out sooner or later. I can't breathe, man.
His father was visibly upset.
Cole's father leaves the room to recover.
Okay. You go to Michael's about 8?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Robert's truck is there.
Okay.
And as I walk up to the truck, he asks me, he said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "For what?" And he said, we're gonna hit the store.
Cole Lincoln went on to explain that a short time later, Frank Hernandez arrived at Michael Richardson's residence.
And so then we go to his house.
What house did y'all go to?
The trailer.
Okay.
He gave me a shirt, and he gave me gloves, the mask.
So what happened then? I mean, who all's at the trailer is what I need to know.
Me, Robert, Michael, and Frank.
Cole Lincoln went on to tell us that Roberto Alvarado gave him the ride up there to the park where he sat and watched the incident take place, and he then provided him with the transportation to leave the area, leave the scene.
It's obvious to us that Roberto's kind of the spearhead. He's providing clothes, vehicle. He was much more than just the getaway driver. And he's using these younger people to do his bidding so he doesn't have to do it directly.
Who had the gun?
Well, first Robert had it.
Okay. And then who had it after that?
Frank Hernandez.
He identified the shooter as Frank Hernandez.
Cole Lincoln is 15 years old. Police arrest him and place him in juvenile detention. Investigators confront Michael Richardson about Frank Hernandez's involvement in the murder.
It was at that point that Michael Richardson confirmed the story given by Cole Lincoln. He had made up the fact that Roberto Alvarado was the shooter.
And you didn't identify Frank Hernandez? Because I thought that if I could get Robert put in jail before any of the other ones, that he wouldn't be able to hurt me or anything.
Are you afraid of Robert?
Yes.
Richardson confirms it was Frank Hernandez, not Robert Alvarado, who shot Conbino.
We now knew that Roberto Alvarado was the getaway driver, provider of the firearm, more or less the mastermind. Michael Richardson was suspect number 2, and Cole Lincoln was also involved as suspect number 3. We suspected that Frank Hernandez was the shooter. It then became priority for us to locate Frank Hernandez. Officers were able to locate Frank Hernandez at his residence. Hernandez was brought to Cleveland Police Department for questioning.
Okay, tell me what's going on.
Robert, he wanted us to lick the store.
Okay. What's a lick mean?
I guess
Rob the store to get the money?
Yeah.
Okay. What happens inside the store? Walk me through the store. You're inside, you got the backpack. You said you put the backpack on the counter. I see the pistol come up. I see it come up. That's when you shot him?
Yes or no? I can't hear you.
Yes, sir.
During the interview with Frank Hernandez, he confessed to his involvement.
So yes, so what did he do when you shot him?
He fell to them. He was calling. He mean to shoot him.
You didn't mean to shoot him. But the reason you shot him, because you know what's behind there, the little push button to alert the cops, right? I mean, I know it's happening fast, bud, but you were scared that he's gonna push the alarm. Yes or no? What? No. So you just cold-blooded shot him for no reason?
He seemed to have little care for what he had done.
Investigators arrest Frank Hernandez for capital murder. After his arrest, Hernandez directs them to the location of the pistol that shot Convino.
Frank Hernandez, he told us where we could find the murder weapon. It happened to be on the same property where we recovered Roberto Alvarado's vehicle. The handgun was found in the backyard of the residence. It was a relief that we were able to recover the murder weapon and get all of the subjects involved in custody.
Frank Hernandez, Robert Alvarado, and Michael Richardson are all charged with capital murder. Cole Lincoln is charged as a minor. Witness testimony heard at the trials of Alvarado and Hernandez details the events that led to Convino's murder.
Robert Alvarado was looking to be some sort of gang leader to younger, more impressionable kids. He came up with the idea to commit the aggravated robbery at the store. He felt that the store was an easy target because it was located on the edge of town, and he could recruit these kids to do it.
Tie that back into what he did after he shot Convino, stepping over him, completing the robbery, stepping back over him to leave. It told me a lot about Frank. It's kind of hard to imagine something that would be more callous than that. If these guys told Convino that they needed to borrow a couple $100, he probably would have gave it to him. But they took it, and they took his life for it.
The video was the #1 piece of evidence. It's unbiased. It tells the story like it happened. The video was critical. It was sad. I mean, these kids, 17 years old, convicted of capital murder, destroyed not only their lives, their families' lives, but they destroyed an innocent person's life, all for a little bit of money.
But I want them to know that he had a family in India. But he also had a Texas family.
Next time on See No Evil.
Police department. He's still moving and breathing. You could see bloody footprints. A person was there looking for something.
Don't ever think it could happen to your child.
Did things get out of control?
The rain had not stopped for 3 days in Seattle, the kind of relentless, cold drizzle that seeps into the bones and makes the city feel like it's holding its breath. On the morning of October 17th, 1993, a jogger cut through a narrow trail along the edge of Discovery Park, headphones in, eyes down, moving through the mist like a ghost among ghosts, until something broke the rhythm. Not a sound, not a voice, just a shape. Wrong. Still. Too still. At first, it looked like discarded clothing, a pile of dark fabric half hidden beneath wet leaves. But then came the color. Pale. Human. A hand, fingers slightly curled, as if reaching for something that never came. Police would later say the call came in at 6:42 a.m. Possible body. By 7:10, the area was sealed. By 8 o'clock, the first whispers began to ripple through the quiet neighborhoods nearby. By noon, it was no longer a rumor. It was a headline. Young woman found dead. No ID. No witnesses. No clear cause. A cold case before the day was even over. The victim would eventually be identified as 24-year-old Melissa Grant, a bookstore clerk who lived alone in a modest apartment in Ballard. She had been reported missing 2 days earlier by a coworker who noticed she hadn't shown up for her shift, a detail that, at the time, didn't seem urgent. Melissa was quiet, kept to herself, the kind of person who could disappear for a weekend without raising alarms. Until she didn't come back. When detectives entered her apartment, nothing appeared out of place. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. A mug sat on the kitchen counter, coffee long gone cold, a thin ring marking the last moment anyone could trace her routine. Her bed was made. Her coat was missing. Her keys were gone. It looked like she had simply stepped out and then vanished into the rain. The autopsy complicated everything. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no defensive wounds, no clear indication of how she had died. Toxicology reports came back inconclusive. But there was something else, something subtle, almost overlooked in the early hours. A faint mark on her wrist. Not quite a bruise. Not quite a cut. Just pressure. A grip, perhaps. Or restraint. It was enough to suggest she hadn't gone willingly. Detectives canvassed the area. Neighbors. Coworkers. Anyone who might have seen her in those final hours. The answers came back the same, over and over again, like a broken recording. She kept to herself. She was nice but quiet. I didn't really know her. No enemies. No known relationships. No one who stood out. A life so small it left almost no trace. And yet, someone had noticed her. Someone had followed her. Someone had ended her life and left her in the woods as if she were nothing more than another piece of debris washed ashore by the city's endless rain. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Leads dried up. Tips led nowhere. A composite sketch was attempted based on a vague description from a witness who thought they had seen Melissa speaking to a man near a bus stop the night she disappeared. The description was frustratingly generic. Male. Average height. Dark jacket. The kind of figure that could blend into any street, any crowd, any city. The kind of man no one remembers until it's too late. By early 1994, the case had already begun to cool. Detectives reassigned. Files archived. Melissa Grant's name joined a growing list of unsolved cases, each one a quiet failure buried beneath paperwork and time. But the community didn't forget. Not entirely. For years, her face would appear in local news segments, usually late at night, usually after more pressing stories had taken the spotlight. Still unsolved. Police seek information. Cold case. Words that carried weight, but no resolution. Her co-workers lit candles on the anniversary of her disappearance. Her landlord kept her apartment vacant for months, unable, or unwilling, to rent it out. There was a sense, unspoken but deeply felt, that something had been taken from them. Not just a life, but a sense of safety, of normalcy. Because if someone like Melissa could vanish without a trace, what did that say about the rest of them? Years passed. Technology advanced. DNA analysis, once a slow and uncertain process, became faster, sharper, more precise. Cases long thought unsolvable began to crack open, one by one, under the weight of new evidence. Old samples were re-examined. Forgotten details brought back into the light. And somewhere, buried in a sealed evidence bag, was a trace, a fragment. Something too small to matter in 1993, but impossible to ignore decades later. It wasn't much. Just a few skin cells found beneath Melissa's fingernails. At the time, they had been cataloged and stored, but the technology to fully analyze them didn't exist. Not in a way that could point to a specific individual. But now, decades later, everything had changed. The case file was pulled from storage. Dust shaken off. Names revisited. Evidence reprocessed. Detectives, new ones, unfamiliar with the original investigation, began to piece together a story that had been left unfinished for nearly 30 years. And what they found would shock the city. Because the answer, when it finally came, was not hiding in some distant corner of Melissa's life. It wasn't a stranger passing through, or a drifter slipping through the cracks. It was someone much closer. Someone no one had ever suspected. The kind of revelation that doesn't just solve a case, it rewrites everything people thought they knew. But in 1993, none of that was visible yet. All they had was a body in the rain, a life cut short, and a silence that refused to be broken. And somewhere out there in the city, a man walked free, blending into crowds, passing unnoticed, carrying a secret that would remain buried for decades. A secret that, even then, was already beginning to rot beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would finally come back to life. The file never truly disappeared. It just sank, layer by layer, beneath newer cases, louder crimes, fresher blood, until Melissa Grant became a name that only surfaced when someone deliberately went looking for it, a cold case buried in steel cabinets and fading ink, tagged, indexed, and quietly waiting for a question no one had the tools to answer in 1993. But time has a way of sharpening questions, of turning silence into pressure and pressure into cracks, and by the late 2010s, those cracks were beginning to show. The evidence box was smaller than expected. A cardboard container sealed with aging tape, labeled in block letters, Grant, Melissa, homicide, October 17, 93. Inside, everything that remained of the investigation, photographs curled at the edges, reports typed on machines long obsolete, a cassette tape of an interview no one had listened to in years, and at the bottom, almost overlooked, a thin plastic envelope containing the scrapings taken from beneath her fingernails. It didn't look like much. It never had. Back then, it was logged and stored because protocol demanded it, not because anyone believed it would speak. But now, in a lab flooded with fluorescent light and humming machines, that fragment was no longer silent. Technicians worked in controlled stillness, gloved hands, sterile instruments, extracting what 1993 couldn't. DNA, not just partial, not just a vague marker of identity, but something deeper, something that could stretch across databases, across bloodlines, across time itself. Genetic genealogy. A term that didn't exist when Melissa was found. A method that had already begun to crack cases thought impossible. The first results didn't point to a suspect. They never do. Instead, they mapped connections, distant relatives, fragments of a family tree scattered across states, names linked by percentages and probabilities. Third cousins. Fourth cousins. People who had never heard of Melissa Grant, people who had no idea they were now part of something buried decades ago. Detectives followed the branches. They built the tree slowly, methodically, each name a step closer to a center that remained hidden. Marriage records, birth certificates, obituaries, social media profiles, old yearbooks. Every piece stitched together into a living network of connections, narrowing, tightening, focusing. And then one name began to stand out. Not because it screamed guilt, not because it had been flagged before, but because it fit too neatly into a space that had always been empty. Daniel Hargrove. In 1993, he was 28 years old, lived less than 2 miles from Melissa's apartment, worked as a maintenance technician for a property management company, a job that gave him access to buildings, keys, routines. A job that placed him inside spaces people assumed were safe. His name had never appeared in the original case file, not once, which made what came next feel less like discovery and more like something overlooked, something that had always been there, just beyond the edge of visibility. Detectives dug deeper. Hargrove had no criminal record in 1993, no arrests, no charges, nothing that would have drawn attention. On paper, he was invisible. Stable employment, no known history of violence. The kind of man neighbors might describe as quiet or keeps to himself. The same words used to describe Melissa. 2 quiet lives, moving through the same small radius of the same city, never intersecting on record, but proximity has its own language, and now that language was starting to speak. Old employment logs were pulled, work orders, maintenance requests, addresses. And there it was, October 15th, 1993, 2 days before Melissa's body was found. A service call to her building. The details were minimal. Lock issue. Tenant reported difficulty with front door. No name listed for the tenant. No signature confirming who performed the work. But the assignment sheet showed the technician scheduled for that block that day. Daniel Hargrove. It was the first real connection. The first moment where two separate lines finally crossed. And suddenly, the case shifted. What had once looked like a random act, a faceless crime committed in the shadows, now began to take shape as something more contained, more personal, more calculated. Not a stranger in the night, but a man with access. A man who could knock on a door without raising suspicion. A man who could step inside without forcing his way in. Melissa's apartment had shown no signs of struggle. Because maybe at first there wasn't one. The theory began to form in fragments. He arrives under the pretense of a repair. She lets him in. The door closes. Something changes. Something goes wrong, or maybe something goes exactly as planned. The mark on her wrist. The absence of defensive wounds. The quiet. It all began to align in a way that felt both inevitable and deeply unsettling. But theory isn't proof. And after nearly 30 years, proof is a fragile thing. Detectives needed more than a name on a work order and a genetic connection. They needed to place him there, to tie him directly to Melissa in a way that would hold under scrutiny, in a courtroom, under the weight of everything that had passed since 1993. So they went back again. Back to the cassette tapes. The interviews. Voices frozen in time, speaking from a moment when the truth was still fresh, still unshaped by decades of memory and reinterpretation. One tape in particular stood out. A neighbor, apartment 3B, interviewed the day after Melissa was reported missing. The audio crackled as it played, the sound warped, but the voice came through. "I saw someone," the neighbor said. "I think it was Friday. Late afternoon. There was a guy in the hallway. Didn't recognize him. He said he was there for maintenance." A pause. He knocked on Melissa's door. Another pause. "I didn't think anything of it at the time." The description followed. Vague. Frustratingly so. But now, with Hargrove in focus, it carried new weight. The age matched. The job matched. The timing matched. What had once been a dead end was now a thread. And detectives pulled. They tracked Hargrove's life forward from 1993. Where he moved. Where he worked. Who he knew. Patterns began to emerge. Not crimes, not charges, but something else. Complaints. Minor incidents. Tenants who reported uncomfortable encounters. A woman who claimed he entered her apartment without proper notice. Nothing that had ever escalated. Nothing that had ever stuck. But enough to paint a picture. Enough to suggest that Melissa may not have been an isolated incident, but the only one that crossed a line no one could ignore. And still, Hargrove himself remained just out of reach. Because time had given him something the original investigation never had. Distance. By the early 2000s, he had left Seattle. Moved south. New job. New life. The trail didn't go cold, but it stretched, thinned, became harder to follow with the same clarity. Until finally, it stopped. A death certificate. Natural causes. No arrest. No charges. No interrogation. No moment where the truth was forced into the open. If Daniel Hargrove was the man they were looking for, then he had carried that secret to his grave. And for a moment it looked like that would be the end of it. Another almost solved case. Another name added too late. Another story without a voice to answer the questions that still lingered. But the evidence, the DNA, didn't care about timelines or endings. It remained clear, precise, unambiguous. A match. Not a possibility. Not a theory. A connection written in biology itself, tying Hargrove to Melissa in a way that could not be explained away, not by coincidence, Not by proximity, not by anything other than contact. Direct contact. The kind that leaves traces beneath fingernails. The kind that speaks of struggle, even when the body shows none. And suddenly, the silence that had surrounded Melissa Grant's death for nearly 3 decades was broken. Not by a confession, not by a witness stepping forward, but by something far colder, far more definitive. Science. The announcement came quietly at first. A press release. A statement. Words chosen carefully, deliberately, acknowledging the breakthrough without the spectacle that often follows such revelations. But the impact was immediate. Seattle 1993 cold case solved. New technology exposes unexpected killer. Headlines that echoed across the city, across the country, pulling Melissa's name back into the light after years in the dark. But for those who remembered, for the neighbors, the co-workers, the few people who had held on to her memory, the shock wasn't just in the resolution. It was in who. Because Daniel Hargrove had never been a suspect. He had been a presence. A man who moved through spaces without leaving a mark anyone noticed. Until he did. And by then, it was already too late. The case was closed, on paper. But closure is a complicated thing. Because there are no answers from the dead. No explanation for why Melissa Grant. No moment where the truth is spoken aloud, where the weight of it can be seen, heard, understood. Only the evidence. Only the fragments. Only the knowledge that, for nearly 30 years, the man responsible had lived an ordinary life, walked ordinary streets, spoken ordinary words, while carrying something no one else could see. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between those years, the memory of a rainy morning in 1993 still lingers. A jogger on a trail. A shape in the mist. A hand reaching for something that never came. And the realization, long delayed but finally undeniable, that the answer had been there all along. Just waiting for the world to catch up. The moment the DNA match was confirmed, the case stopped being a mystery in the traditional sense and became something else entirely. A reconstruction of a moment that had already happened, a sequence of events that could no longer be interrupted, only understood in fragments, and even then, understanding did not mean clarity, because clarity requires answers from a mind that is no longer present, only echoes preserved in traces too small to see, but too precise to deny. Inside the offices of the investigative unit, the tone shifted. Conversations became shorter. Movements more deliberate. Files that had sat untouched for years were now being handled with a kind of cautious urgency, as if disturbing them too abruptly might cause something fragile to collapse before it could be fully examined. Daniel Hargrove was no longer a name in a database. He was a focal point, a reference around which everything else began to align. But alignment does not equal explanation. The first question that surfaced was not about how the DNA was found, but how it got there in the first place, because beneath every solved cold case lies a simpler, more unsettling question. What actually happened in those final moments that allowed such a trace to be left behind? The working theory expanded, refined through hours of re-examining old statements and reinterpreting small details that had once seemed insignificant. Melissa Grant, last seen leaving her workplace late on the evening of October 15, 1993, had followed her usual routine. Coworkers confirmed she locked up around closing time. No unusual behavior. No visible distress. No indication she expected anything different from the walk home that night. Her apartment, just a short distance from the bookstore, required a path through familiar streets, dimly lit in places, quiet in others, the kind of route she had likely taken countless times without incident. The absence of surveillance in that era meant there were no cameras to confirm her movements, no digital footprint to track her steps, only the recollections of those who may or may not have noticed her passing by. But one detail now carried more weight than it ever had before: the maintenance request log 2 days prior. A lock issue. Simple on its surface, almost mundane in context. But in hindsight, it suggested access. It suggested a moment when someone was inside the building, interacting with the infrastructure of the space itself, not as an outsider breaking in, but as someone operating within a system that granted entry without question. Hargrove's role as a maintenance technician placed him in a position that blended invisibility with authority. Tenants rarely questioned someone who arrived in uniform, carrying tools, referencing work orders. Doors opened not because they were forced, but because they were expected to. And expectation is often the most effective disguise. Detectives revisited the building records. They interviewed former residents who still remembered living there in the early 90s. Most had little to contribute, their memories blurred by time. But a few recalled a man who handled repairs, a man who came and went, a man whose presence didn't stand out until the idea of him being tied to a crime forced those memories into sharper focus. Descriptions began to coalesce, not precise, not definitive, but consistent enough to build a pattern. A man who was polite but distant, efficient, unremarkable in conversation. Someone who did his job and left without drawing attention. The kind of person people forget almost immediately after closing the door behind him. That forgettability, in itself, became part of the profile. Because in investigations like this, visibility is often what leads to detection, but invisibility is what allows opportunity. And opportunity, in this case, appears to have been everything. Reconstructing the timeline required a blend of evidence and inference. On October 15th, Hargrove is documented entering the building for maintenance work. At some point during that window, he would have been inside the environment Melissa called home. Whether she encountered him then or later remained uncertain, but the connection between his presence in the building and her disappearance could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The interval between that day and the discovery of her body on October 17th suggested a sequence that unfolded away from public view. No reported disturbance in the building. No alarms triggered. No neighbors recalling a commotion that would have stood out as unusual. Whatever occurred, it did not present itself as a scene of chaos, but rather something contained, controlled, and concealed. That absence of disruption complicated the narrative. Violent crimes often leave visible marks on their surroundings, broken objects, forced entry, signs of struggle that extend beyond the immediate victim. In this case, the environment remained largely intact, suggesting that either the interaction began under conditions of trust or familiarity, or that any escalation happened in a way that minimized external disturbance. The mark beneath Melissa's fingernails became one of the few tangible indicators of resistance. Not enough to reconstruct a full struggle, but sufficient to indicate contact that was not entirely one-sided. The presence of foreign DNA in that context implies an exchange, grasping, pulling, defensive reaction, moments compressed into seconds that left behind biological evidence without preserving the physical sequence that produced it. Forensic analysts revisited that evidence with modern tools, extracting more from the sample than had been possible decades earlier. The profile they generated was not partial in the way older methods often produced. It was complete enough to stand as a direct identifier, eliminating ambiguity that might otherwise have left room for doubt. That level of certainty transformed the case from speculative reconstruction into confirmed connection. But confirmation of identity does not reveal intent. Intent remains the most elusive element in any unresolved crime because it exists only in the mind of the individual who is no longer available to explain it. Without statements, without confessions, investigators are left to infer motivation from behavior patterns, situational context, and any documented history that might hint at underlying tendencies. In Hargrove's case, the historical record offered limited insight, but not nothing. Minor complaints from tenants over the years painted a picture of boundary violations that, while not escalating into criminal charges, suggested a willingness to overstep professional limits. Entry into private spaces, without clear justification. Interactions that left individuals uneasy enough to report them, even if those reports did not result in formal action. Those details, taken individually, remained within the realm of concern rather than proof. But when viewed collectively and placed alongside the confirmed DNA match and the timeline of access, they contributed to a broader profile that investigators could not ignore. Still, the absence of a confession meant that the narrative remained incomplete. There were no recorded statements from Hargrove regarding Melissa Grant. No documented interactions between them outside of circumstantial overlap. No known relationship, personal or professional, that would clearly explain why she, specifically, became involved in a fatal encounter. That gap between presence and purpose became the central tension of the case. Because presence can be established, purpose must be interpreted. And interpretation, even when supported by evidence, carries the weight of uncertainty that only direct testimony can remove. As the investigation progressed, attention also turned toward the broader implications of the case. For years, Melissa's death had been categorized alongside other unsolved incidents, each one representing a failure of the available methods at the time. The breakthrough in her case was not just about identifying an individual, but about demonstrating how advances in forensic science could reshape long-standing assumptions about what could and could not be solved. Evidence that had once been considered exhausted was now yielding results. Samples preserved for decades were being re-examined with techniques that could isolate genetic markers with far greater precision than previously imagined. In that sense, Melissa Grant's case became part of a larger pattern, one in which time itself had become a variable in solving crimes that had resisted earlier efforts. But progress in investigation does not erase the passage of time in human terms. For those who had known Melissa, the resolution arrived without the emotional immediacy that might have come had it occurred within months or even years of her disappearance. Instead, it came as a distant correction, a statement that arrived long after grief had already settled into memory and memory had already been reshaped by absence. Her family, contacted with the results, faced a reality that was both clarifying and incomplete. Knowing who was responsible provided a name, a face, a context that had been missing for decades. Yet it did not bring back the conversations that never happened, the milestones that were never shared, the ordinary moments that define a life as much as its final chapter. The community reaction followed a similar pattern. Relief mixed with disbelief. Recognition that a long-standing question had finally been answered, combined with the unsettling realization that the individual responsible had lived among them, unnoticed for years. The idea that someone could exist so close, so integrated into daily life, while carrying a secret of that magnitude, challenged assumptions about safety, familiarity, and the limits of observation. And in the background of all these reactions, the case itself continued to settle into its final form, not as a closed book, but as a record that had reached the end of its active investigation while still leaving behind questions that no amount of evidence could fully resolve. Because even with the DNA match, even with the timeline alignment, even with the reconstructed access and behavior patterns, the exact moment when intent turned into action remains unseen. No recording captures it. No witness describes it in full. No document preserves the internal shift that precedes irreversible decisions. All that remains are the traces left behind afterward. And, in this case, those traces were enough to identify who, but not enough to explain why. Which meant that, even in resolution, the case retained a quiet, unresolved edge, a reminder that some answers arrive complete in one sense and still incomplete in another, leaving behind a space where certainty ends and interpretation begins. And where the memory of a rainy morning in Seattle continues to exist not as a solved mystery, but as a moment that, despite everything uncovered, still resists full understanding. The investigation, now anchored by a confirmed identity, began to shift from discovery into reconstruction. And reconstruction is never a straight line because once a name is attached to a sequence of events, every fragment of evidence must be re-examined, not just for what it shows, but for what it implies in relation to that name. And in the case of Daniel Hargrove, implication became the driving force behind every new angle, every revisited report, every overlooked detail that suddenly carried meaning it had never carried before. Detectives returned once again to the maintenance records from October 1993, but this time the focus was narrower, more exact. Instead of scanning for anomalies across the entire system, they isolated the specific timeframe surrounding Hargrove's assigned work order. The logs confirmed his presence in the building, but what they could not confirm was the exact duration of his stay, nor the full scope of his movements once inside. In an era without digital tracking, without access logs that recorded entry and exit timestamps, the physical presence of a worker in a residential building was often inferred rather than documented with precision. A signature on a work order might indicate completion, but it did not account for what happened between arrival and departure. That gap, those unrecorded minutes, became the space where investigators now had to look for answers. Attention turned to the building layout itself. Floor plans were retrieved, studied, and overlaid with tenant testimonies. The goal was to understand movement within the structure, which stairwells were accessible, how hallways connected, where sightlines might allow or prevent observation. Melissa's apartment, located on an upper floor, required passage through shared corridors, spaces where a maintenance worker could reasonably be present without raising suspicion. The architecture of the building, once considered ordinary, now took on investigative significance. Narrow hallways, limited lighting, and minimal surveillance created an environment where interactions could occur without witnesses, where brief encounters could unfold unnoticed by others living nearby. Former residents were re-interviewed when possible. Some had moved away, others declined to participate, but a few agreed to share what they remembered. Their recollections, though fragmented, added subtle layers to the timeline. One tenant recalled hearing footsteps late in the afternoon, not hurried, not unusual, but present. Another mentioned seeing a maintenance worker carrying tools earlier that day, though they could not confirm whether it was Hargrove specifically. Memory, shaped by time, is inherently unreliable in its details but often consistent in its impressions. What stood out in these accounts was not precision, but the absence of anything alarming. No loud disturbances. No raised voices. No indications that anything out of the ordinary was taking place in the moments leading up to Melissa's disappearance. That absence continued to define the case, because the lack of reported disturbance suggested either a scenario that unfolded quietly or one that began under circumstances that did not immediately trigger alarm. Investigators began to examine the possibility that Melissa may have encountered Hargrove in a context that did not initially feel threatening. As a maintenance technician, his presence in the building would have been routine. If she had encountered him in the hallway, or if he had approached her door under the pretense of work, the interaction might not have been perceived as unusual at first glance. That initial perception could have influenced how the encounter progressed. But without direct evidence of their interaction prior to the moment of contact, these remain interpretations built upon structural possibilities rather than confirmed events. Still, the consistency of Hargrove's access, combined with his documented presence during the relevant time frame, created a convergence that investigators could not ignore. Parallel to the building analysis, attention returned to the forensic evidence, particularly the DNA sample that had ultimately identified Hargrove. Technicians revisited the chain of custody, verifying that the sample had remained intact, properly stored, and uncontaminated throughout the decades it had been preserved. The integrity of the evidence was critical, not just for the purposes of confirmation, but for any potential legal proceedings that might follow. Modern forensic protocols allowed for reanalysis with enhanced sensitivity, and additional testing was conducted to extract as much information as possible from the remaining material. The results reinforced the original match, eliminating ambiguity and strengthening the evidentiary foundation of the case. Beyond identification, however, forensic science offered limited insight into behavior or intent. The DNA could confirm contact, but it could not explain the circumstances under which that contact occurred. It could indicate presence, but not sequence. It could establish connection, but not narrative. To fill those gaps, investigators returned to circumstantial evidence, layering together small details that, individually, might have seemed insignificant, but collectively contributed to a more cohesive picture. Employment history showed that Hargrove had maintained consistent work and roles that provided access to residential environments. His familiarity with building systems, combined with his routine responsibilities, placed him in positions where interactions with tenants were expected rather than questioned. Interviews with former colleagues painted him as competent and reserved, not particularly social, but reliable in completing assigned tasks. No overt signs of misconduct were documented in workplace records, though informal accounts suggested that he sometimes deviated from strict procedural boundaries when interacting with residents. These deviations, while not formally documented as violations, aligned with the complaints filed by tenants over the years. In several instances, individuals reported that he had entered their apartments without prior notification or remained in their space longer than expected. While none of these incidents escalated into formal charges, they contributed to a pattern of behavior that raised concerns when viewed in aggregate. Investigators carefully avoided drawing conclusions based solely on these reports, recognizing that correlation does not inherently establish causation. However, when combined with the confirmed DNA evidence and the timeline of access, these behavioral patterns added context that could not be dismissed outright. The challenge lay in distinguishing between coincidence and relevance. In cold case investigations, the passage of time often blurs that distinction because evidence that might have been more clearly interpreted in the immediate aftermath becomes fragmented, reliant on records, recollections, and preserved materials that must now be reassembled without the benefit of real-time observation. In Melissa Grant's case, the reconstruction required bridging nearly 3 decades of informational gaps. Each new piece of evidence did not stand alone. It had to be evaluated in relation to everything else that had been uncovered since the case was reopened. As the investigative team continued to synthesize their findings, they began to draft a working narrative that attempted to align all available data points into a coherent sequence. This narrative remained provisional, subject to revision as new information emerged, but it served as a framework for understanding how the known elements of the case might have interacted. According to this reconstruction, Hargrove's presence in the building on October 15th placed him in proximity to Melissa at a time when she was still following her normal routine. The maintenance assignment provided a legitimate reason for him to be on site, granting access to shared spaces without drawing attention. At some point during that window, an interaction occurred that resulted in direct physical contact, as evidenced by the DNA found beneath her fingernails. The nature of that interaction, whether it began as routine, accidental, or deliberate, remains undetermined, but the presence of biological material suggests a moment of contact that escalated beyond a passive exchange. From that point forward, the sequence becomes less certain. The absence of witnesses, combined with the lack of visible disturbance in the building, limits the ability to trace each step with precision. What is known is that Melissa was not seen alive after that time frame, and her body was discovered 2 days later in a wooded area within Discovery Park. The location of the body introduced another layer of complexity. Discovery Park, expansive and partially secluded, contains numerous trails and areas that can be accessed without drawing attention, particularly in 1993 when foot traffic and surveillance were far less monitored than in later years. Transporting a body to such a location would have required time and access to a vehicle or sufficient proximity to move between locations without interruption. No direct evidence has been recovered to indicate how Melissa was transported from the building to the park. No vehicle records, no eyewitness accounts, no physical traces that definitively link the two locations. This gap remains one of the most significant unresolved aspects of the case. Despite this, the placement of the body itself suggests an intentional effort to conceal or distance the scene from the point of origin. The choice of location, rather than being random, aligns with patterns observed in other cases where perpetrators seek environments that reduce the likelihood of immediate discovery. Yet, even here, interpretation must be cautious. Without direct confirmation, the motivations behind the selection of Discovery Park remain inferred rather than proven. As the investigation progressed, attention also turned to Hargrove's life after 1993, tracing his movements beyond Seattle. Records indicated that he relocated within a few years, establishing residence in another state where he continued working in similar roles. His ability to maintain a low profile, avoid legal entanglements, and integrate into new environments without incident complicated efforts to assess whether his behavior changed over time or remained consistent with earlier patterns. There were no known criminal convictions, no documented escalations that would have brought renewed scrutiny during his lifetime. To outward appearances, his life followed a trajectory that, while unremarkable, was stable and uninterrupted by major disruptions. And then, in 2011, his death marked the end of any possibility for direct inquiry. With his passing, the investigation lost the potential for interviews, interrogations, or confession. What remained was a closed timeline, bounded by the years he lived and the evidence preserved from the earlier stages of a case. This transition from an active subject to a historical figure within the context of the investigation altered the nature of what could be achieved moving forward. Without the ability to question Hargrove directly, investigators had to rely entirely on existing records and forensic data to support their conclusions. The case, in effect, became static in terms of primary evidence, even as interpretations continued to evolve. At this stage, the focus began to shift toward compiling the findings into a comprehensive report, one that would document the process by which the identification was made, the evidence supporting it, and the limitations that remained despite the breakthrough. Because even in solved cold cases, there is an acknowledgement that resolution does not always equate to completeness. Some elements remain beyond reach. Some questions remain unanswered. And some moments, once lost to time, can only be approached through fragments that suggest more than they reveal. In Melissa Grant's case, those fragments had finally converged on a name. But the full story, what transpired in those critical moments, how the interaction unfolded, and why it escalated to its fatal conclusion, remains partially obscured, preserved not in clarity, but in the enduring gaps between evidence and explanation. Gaps that no amount of technological advancement can entirely eliminate, only narrow. As the report began to take shape, another layer of scrutiny emerged, one that extended beyond the immediate facts of the case and into the mechanics of how those facts were interpreted, because in cold case investigations, the line between discovery and confirmation is never automatic. It must be reinforced through repetition, cross-verification, and a relentless return to the same evidence from different angles, each pass designed not to find something new, but to ensure that nothing has been overlooked in what was already known. The DNA evidence, now central to the case, underwent additional rounds of validation. Independent analysts reviewed the profiles generated from the original fingernail scrapings, comparing them against multiple databases and rerunning the samples through updated sequencing protocols. The results remain consistent. Each iteration reinforced the same conclusion: a direct genetic link between the biological material recovered from Melissa Grant and the profile associated with Daniel Hargrove. This consistency mattered, not just for scientific certainty, but for procedural integrity. In cases that rely heavily on forensic breakthroughs, the credibility of the outcome depends on the ability to demonstrate that the findings are reproducible, verifiable, and free from contamination or procedural error. Every safeguard was revisited, every step documented, every potential point of failure examined and accounted for. With that foundation reaffirmed, investigators shifted their focus back to the human elements of the case, particularly the question of interaction. DNA confirms contact, but it does not specify context. To bridge that gap, the team analyzed behavioral patterns associated with both individuals, attempting to reconstruct a plausible framework for how their paths may have intersected in a way that led to physical confrontation. Melissa Grant's routine, as reconstructed from employment records and witness statements, followed a predictable structure. She worked consistent hours at the bookstore, maintained a relatively quiet social life, and adhered to a limited set of daily movements between her workplace and her residence. This consistency, while offering stability in her life, also meant that her patterns were observable, even if she herself was not particularly outward or expressive. Hargrove's routine, in contrast, was shaped by the nature of his occupation. Maintenance work required mobility, adaptability, and access to multiple locations within a given property. His schedule was not fixed in the same way as Melissa's, but instead varied based on assignments, requests, and operational needs. This variability created opportunities for overlap, moments where his presence in a building could coincide with the presence of residents in ways that were not explicitly scheduled or anticipated. That overlap became a focal point in understanding how the two individuals could have encountered one another without prior connection. Investigators considered the possibility that Melissa may have interacted with Hargrove in a professional context before the night of her disappearance. Maintenance workers often pass through the same environments repeatedly, building familiarity with tenants over time, even if those interactions remain brief and transactional. If such familiarity existed, it could have influenced how Melissa perceived his presence on the day of the incident. However, no records or testimonies definitively confirmed repeated interactions between them prior to October 15th. This absence of documented familiarity left open the question of whether their encounter was isolated or part of a series of unnoticed or unrecorded exchanges. The analysis of Hargrove's work history provided additional insight into his access patterns. Employment records indicated that his role involved routine entry into residential units for inspections, repairs, and maintenance tasks. In many cases, such work required coordination with tenants, but also allowed for situations where access was granted with minimal oversight, particularly if a tenant was not present or if permission had been prearranged through property management channels. This type of access, while standard within the industry, carries an inherent level of trust. It assumes that individuals performing maintenance duties will adhere to professional boundaries and operate within the expectations set by their employers and the residents they serve. In Hargrove's case, that trust appears to have been a critical component of how he was able to move through the environment without drawing attention. The investigation then turned to a closer examination of Melissa's final known movements. While precise tracking was impossible due to the limitations of the time period, interviews and indirect accounts suggested that she left the bookstore after closing, likely carrying personal items consistent with her routine. No unusual purchases or deviations from her typical behavior were identified in the hours leading up to her disappearance. The absence of deviation reinforced the notion that whatever occurred did not begin with an obvious change in her daily pattern. Instead, it may have unfolded within the framework of normalcy. This possibility introduced a critical variable into the analysis: the role of perception at the moment of initial contact. If Melissa encountered Hargrove under circumstances that appeared routine, such as a maintenance-related interaction, the initial threshold for suspicion would have been low. In such scenarios, individuals often rely on contextual cues, uniforms, tools, identification, and situational expectations to determine whether an interaction is safe or benign. Hargrove's position would have provided those cues. That alignment between role and environment is not evidence of wrongdoing in itself, but in investigative terms, it establishes a plausible pathway through which contact could occur without immediate alarm. From there, the transition from interaction to escalation becomes the central unknown. The DNA evidence indicates that a physical confrontation occurred at some point, as suggested by the presence of foreign material beneath Melissa's fingernails. This type of evidence typically arises during moments of resistance, when an individual attempts to defend themselves or break free from contact. The nature of such contact can vary widely, from brief physical restraint to prolonged struggle, but in all cases, it signifies a shift from passive interaction to active conflict. The exact trigger for that shift in this case remains unidentified. No recorded statements from witnesses describe an altercation within the building. No emergency calls were placed during the time frame in question. No alarms or disturbances were reported that would indicate a sudden and visible escalation. This absence suggests that if a confrontation occurred, it did so in a manner that did not produce immediate external signals detectable by others in the vicinity. That quietness, however, should not be mistaken for absence of conflict. Rather, it suggests that any conflict that occurred was contained within a limited space, away from observation, and likely resolved before it could attract attention. Following the discovery of Melissa's body, the original investigation focused heavily on identifying suspects within her known social circle. Friends, co-workers, acquaintances, anyone who might have had a connection to her personal life. This approach, standard for the time, prioritized relationships that were visible and documented. However, because no clear connections or conflicts were identified among those individuals, the investigation gradually expanded outward, though without producing definitive leads. Hargrove, operating outside of Melissa's known social network and without documented interaction in her personal records, was not included in those early suspect pools. His role as a maintenance technician placed him in a category that, at the time, did not trigger immediate association with potential suspects in the absence of overt evidence. This distinction between those within a victim's social sphere and those operating in peripheral professional roles highlighted a limitation in investigative focus during the early stages of a case. Without the technological tools available today, identifying connections that did not involve direct social relationships was significantly more challenging. In the years following the initial investigation, as forensic capabilities evolved, the ability to link individuals through genetic material opened new pathways for identifying connections that were previously invisible. Melissa Grant's case became one of those instances where the introduction of modern techniques revealed a link that had remained undetected despite years of prior inquiry. As the investigative team prepared to finalize their findings, they began compiling a comprehensive narrative that integrated all confirmed elements: the timeline of Hargrove's presence in the building, the DNA match linking him to the biological evidence recovered from Melissa, the behavioral patterns associated with his professional access, and the absence of alternative explanations that could account for the presence of his genetic material on the victim. Each of these components, while distinct, converged to form a cohesive evidentiary structure. Yet even as the structure solidified, the limitations of the case remained evident. There were no eyewitness accounts that directly observed the critical moments. No confession that would provide clarity regarding intent or sequence. No recorded documentation that captured the interaction in real time. What exists instead is a layered reconstruction built from fragments, each piece verified, each connection supported by available data, but still separated from the full experiential reality of what transpired. This distinction is important because it underscores the difference between knowing what happened in a general sense and understanding how it unfolded in precise detail. In Melissa Grant's case, the investigation successfully established who was responsible for the biological trace found at the scene. It confirmed that Daniel Hargrove had direct contact with her in a manner consistent with physical interaction. It aligned his presence with the time frame and location associated with her disappearance. But beyond those points, the narrative becomes increasingly dependent on inference. Inference guided by evidence, but not replaced by it. As the report moved closer to completion, investigators acknowledged these boundaries explicitly, documenting not only the conclusions they had reached, but also the questions that remained unresolved. This transparency ensured that the case would be understood not as an absolute account of events, but as a scientifically supported interpretation based on the best available information. In doing so, the case was brought to a level of resolution that satisfied evidentiary standards, while still preserving the inherent uncertainties that accompany any event reconstructed long after its occurrence. And within that space between certainty and ambiguity, the memory of Melissa Grant's final moments continues to exist as both a confirmed outcome and an incomplete story, one defined as much by what has been uncovered as by what can never be fully retrieved from the passage of time. As the investigative report moved beyond reconstruction into formal conclusion, attention inevitably returned to the broader question that had lingered since the first day Melissa Grant's body was discovered. How could a case remain unsolved for so long when the evidence, in retrospect, seemed capable of pointing toward a definitive source? And the answer, as the files made increasingly clear, lay not in a single failure, but in the accumulation of limitations that defined forensic science and investigative methodology at the time. In 1993, DNA profiling existed, but it was constrained by sensitivity, processing time, and the quality of samples required to produce reliable results. The fragment recovered from beneath Melissa's fingernails was preserved, cataloged, and stored, but it did not meet the threshold necessary for identification using the techniques available then. At best, it could have been used to exclude certain individuals if comparisons were available, but without a suspect to compare against, its utility remained dormant. This reality shaped the direction of the original investigation. Without a definitive forensic lead, detectives relied heavily on witness accounts, behavioral patterns, and social connections. These traditional methods, while effective in many cases, depend on the presence of visible relationships or observable conflicts. In situations where the perpetrator operates outside the victim's known network, or where interactions occur within professional or incidental contexts, those methods can fail to produce actionable leads. Melissa's case fit precisely into that category. Her limited social footprint, combined with the absence of known adversaries, meant that investigators were searching within a framework that did not initially include individuals like Daniel Hargrove, whose connection to her existed not through friendship or association, but through proximity and access. At the time, the absence of evidence linking him directly to Melissa meant there was no reason to elevate him as a person of interest. Without forensic confirmation or witness identification, his presence in the building was interpreted as part of routine operations rather than a potential point of intersection in a criminal event. Over time, as the investigation stalled, resources were redirected to cases with more immediate leads. This is a standard practice in law enforcement, where prioritization is often dictated by the availability of actionable information. Cold cases, by definition, enter a state of dormancy, not because they are forgotten, but because they reach a point where further progress requires tools or evidence that are not yet available. Melissa Grant's case remained in that category for decades. The preservation of evidence, however, ensured that when those tools eventually became available, the case could be revisited. This preservation was not accidental. It was the result of procedural protocols designed to maintain the integrity of physical materials over extended periods. Evidence storage systems evolved over time, but the core principle remained consistent. Maintain chain of custody, prevent contamination, and retain samples that may yield future insights as technology advances. When the decision was made to reopen the case, investigators approached it with the understanding that they were not simply re-examining old information, but applying new capabilities to materials that had been waiting for reinterpretation. The introduction of genetic genealogy into forensic investigations represented a significant shift in how unidentified DNA profiles could be analyzed. Instead of relying solely on direct matches within criminal databases, this method allowed investigators to identify potential relatives of an unknown individual by comparing shared genetic markers across publicly available datasets and genealogical records. In Melissa's case, the DNA recovered from beneath her fingernails did not immediately match any known entries in criminal databases. However, through genealogical analysis, investigators were able to identify familial connections that led them to construct a broader genetic profile, narrowing down potential individuals who shared a common lineage. This process is inherently indirect, relying on statistical relationships rather than exact matches at the initial stage. But as the family tree was constructed and refined, the pool of potential matches became smaller, eventually converging on individuals who could reasonably be linked to the unknown profile. Daniel Hargrove emerged from that process not as an immediate suspect, but as a candidate whose genetic profile aligned with the reconstructed lineage derived from the evidence. Once that connection was established, direct comparison confirmed the match, transforming a probabilistic identification into a definitive one. From that point forward, the case transitioned from identification to contextual analysis. Investigators then examined whether the DNA could have been transferred through indirect means. In forensic science, secondary transfer, where biological material is passed from one person to another through an intermediary, must always be considered. However, the location and nature of the DNA found beneath Melissa's fingernails strongly suggested direct contact. Such placement is typically associated with physical interaction involving close proximity, often during moments of resistance or defense. This distinction was critical in evaluating the strength of the evidence. Direct transfer implies a level of physical engagement that aligns with the circumstances of a confrontation, whereas secondary transfer would require a chain of contact that, while possible, is less consistent with the positioning and context of the sample. In this case, the combination of location, quantity, and type of biological material supported the interpretation of direct contact between Melissa and Hargrove. With that conclusion established, the investigation turned toward corroborating elements that could support or contextualize the forensic findings. While DNA provided a direct link, additional evidence was sought to reinforce the timeline and behavioral framework surrounding the incident. Employment records, as previously analyzed, confirmed Hargrove's presence in the building during the relevant period. Maintenance logs placed him on site, and the nature of his role granted him access to residential units without requiring forced entry. This access, while legitimate in a professional context, also created opportunities for unsupervised interaction with tenants. Witness recollections, though limited, provided supporting context. The neighbor who recalled seeing a maintenance worker near Melissa's door contributed an account that, while not definitive in isolation, aligned with the known schedule and activities documented in the work orders. When combined with the forensic evidence, this account gained additional relevance, suggesting a possible point of contact between Hargrove and Melissa. However, it is important to note that witness testimony from decades prior must always be treated with caution. Human memory is subject to distortion over time, influenced by subsequent information, personal interpretation, and the natural fading of details. Investigators accounted for these limitations by treating such accounts as supplementary rather than primary evidence. The strength of the case ultimately rested on the convergence of independent lines of evidence: forensic, documentary, and circumstantial. Each category alone would not have been sufficient to establish a conclusion with confidence. Together, they formed a network of corroboration that supported the identification of Hargrove as the individual associated with the biological material recovered from Melissa Grant. As the report approached its final form, investigators also addressed the legal implications of the findings. Because Hargrove was deceased at the time of identification, traditional prosecution was not possible. There would be no trial, no courtroom testimony, no opportunity for cross-examination or defense presentation. The case would be resolved in an administrative and historical sense rather than through judicial proceedings. This outcome is not uncommon in cold case investigations where the subject of interest is no longer alive. In such instances, the goal shifts from prosecution to resolution, from legal accountability to factual determination. Families and communities often seek closure not only through legal outcomes, but through understanding, and the confirmation of identity provides a level of clarity that had been absent for years. For Melissa Grant's family, the identification of Daniel Hargrove answered the most fundamental question that had persisted since her disappearance. It provided a name to accompany the events that had previously been defined only by uncertainty. While it did not alter the past, it reframed it in a way that allowed for a more complete understanding of what had occurred. In the broader context of law enforcement and forensic science, the case demonstrated the evolving capabilities of investigative techniques and the importance of preserving evidence over long periods. It highlighted how advances in technology can transform cases that were once considered unsolvable into ones that yield definitive answers, even decades after the events in question. At the same time, it underscored the limitations that remain inherent in any investigation that relies on historical data. No amount of technological advancement can recover missing eyewitnesses, reconstruct conversations that were never recorded, or retrieve intentions that were never documented. Those elements remain beyond the reach of even the most sophisticated analytical tools. As such, the conclusion of Melissa Grant's case exists within a defined boundary, one that confirms identity and establishes connection, but stops short of fully reconstructing every aspect of the interaction that led to her death. The evidence identifies who was present, confirms that contact occurred, and aligns that contact with the time frame and location of the incident. But beyond that, the narrative becomes a matter of interpretation supported by inference, rather than direct observation. And in that space, between what is known and what cannot be known, the case retains a quiet complexity that reflects both the power and the limits of modern investigation. Even as the file is marked as resolved, the questions that cannot be answered remain, not as failures of the process, but as reminders of the boundaries that define it, boundaries that no investigation, no matter how advanced, can entirely eliminate. With the evidentiary framework established and the identity confirmed, the investigation entered a phase that was less about discovery and more about consolidation, where each piece of information had to be revisited not for the purpose of finding something new, but to ensure that everything already uncovered fit together in a way that could withstand scrutiny from every conceivable angle, because in cases that hinge on retrospective analysis, the strength of the conclusion depends not only on what is proven, but on what can be consistently reproduced through independent review. The forensic team initiated a final audit of the DNA analysis process, retracing every step from the moment the sample was first extracted from the preserved evidence. This included verifying the conditions under which the sample had been stored over the decades, examining temperature logs, storage logs, and access records to confirm that the integrity of the material had not been compromised at any point. The chain of custody documentation was examined line by line, ensuring that each transfer of the evidence was properly recorded and accounted for. No irregularities were found. The sample had remained sealed, protected, and traceable from the time of its collection in 1993 through to its reanalysis in the present day. This continuity was essential, as any break in the chain of custody could have introduced questions about contamination or tampering, which in turn would have weakened the reliability of the findings. With the forensic integrity confirmed, attention returned once more to the timeline of events surrounding Melissa Grant's disappearance. Investigators constructed a detailed chronological model, mapping known points of activity against estimated intervals where information was lacking. This model served as a visual and analytical tool, allowing the team to identify where overlaps occurred and where gaps remained. Melissa was last confirmed to be at her workplace on the evening of October 15th. From there, her movements become less certain, but the expectation, based on her routine, was that she would return to her apartment shortly after closing. The maintenance work order assigned to Daniel Hargrove placed him in the same building during that same general timeframe, creating a window in which an encounter could plausibly have occurred. Within that window, investigators identified a series of potential scenarios, each based on different assumptions about how the interaction may have unfolded. One scenario considered the possibility of an encounter initiated under professional pretenses, where Hargrove's presence as a maintenance worker provided a legitimate reason for contact. Another scenario examined the potential for an unplanned meeting within shared spaces of the building, such as hallways or entryways, where residents and workers might cross paths without prior arrangement. A third scenario, more speculative in nature, explored the possibility of prior familiarity, though no direct evidence supported repeated interactions between the two individuals. This scenario remained within the realm of possibility, but lacked corroborating data. Across all scenarios, however, one consistent element remained: the presence of Hargrove in the building during the relevant time frame, combined with the forensic evidence linking him directly to Melissa. The investigative team was careful to avoid overextending conclusions beyond what the data could support. Each scenario was evaluated based on plausibility rather than certainty, and none were presented as definitive accounts of what occurred. Instead, they functioned as frameworks to help contextualize the known evidence within a range of possible interpretations. In parallel, analysts reviewed Hargrove's known movements following the incident, as recorded in employment and residential records. His relocation within a few years of 1993 was noted, along with his continued employment in roles that maintained a similar pattern of access to residential or managed properties. This consistency in occupational environment suggested a level of familiarity with systems that granted entry into private spaces, reinforcing the structural context in which his earlier access had occurred. However, investigators were careful not to attribute causation to these patterns. The presence of similar job roles across different locations does not inherently indicate a behavioral trend linked to criminal activity. Instead, these observations were documented as part of a broader profile that described his professional trajectory without assigning intent. The absence of additional criminal records or documented offenses further complicated efforts to characterize his behavior over time. While the complaints filed by tenants in earlier years provided some indication of boundary-related concerns, there was no evidence of escalation into patterns that would have triggered legal intervention or formal disciplinary action. This lack of escalation is significant in understanding how individuals can operate within systems without drawing sustained attention. Minor incidents, when isolated, often do not meet the threshold for formal action. It is only when patterns become visible across multiple instances that they begin to attract scrutiny. In Hargrove's case, those patterns did not converge in a way that resulted in intervention during his lifetime. As part of the final review, investigators also examined alternative explanations for the presence of Hargrove's DNA on Melissa's body. The possibility of indirect transfer, environmental contamination, or secondary contact was evaluated and systematically ruled out based on the location and condition of the sample. The placement of the DNA beneath her fingernails remained a key factor in this assessment. Biological material in that location is typically associated with direct physical interaction, particularly in contexts involving defensive movements. The nature of such deposits makes them less likely to result from incidental contact or environmental exposure and more consistent with scenarios involving close-range engagement. In forensic terms, the specificity of the location strengthens the inference of direct contact, reducing the likelihood that the sample was deposited through indirect means. While no single piece of evidence is interpreted in isolation, the combination of location, quantity, and genetic profile provided a coherent basis for linking the sample directly to Hargrove. With all major elements reviewed, the investigative team began drafting the final summary of findings. This document was not intended to narrate the case in a storytelling format, but rather to present a structured account of the evidence, methodologies, and conclusions reached through the course of the investigation. It included sections detailing the initial discovery of the case, the limitations of the original 1993 investigation, the preservation and subsequent reanalysis of physical evidence, the application of genetic genealogy techniques, the identification of Daniel Hargrove as the source of the DNA, and the corroborating circumstantial evidence that supported this identification. Each section was supported by references to specific records, laboratory reports, interview transcripts, and archival materials, ensuring that the conclusions were grounded in documented sources rather than interpretive summaries alone. At the same time, the report acknowledged the limitations inherent in reconstructing historical events. It explicitly noted that while the identity of the individual associated with the biological evidence had been established, the precise sequence of actions, the motivations behind those actions, and the internal decision-making processes that led to the outcome could not be fully determined. These limitations were not presented as shortcomings of the investigation, but as natural boundaries of what can be known when dealing with events that occurred decades in the past without continuous documentation. In closing sections of the report, investigators emphasized the role of technological advancement in enabling the resolution of the case. Without modern DNA analysis and genealogical tools, the evidence recovered in 1993 would have remained insufficient for identification. It was only through the convergence of preserved materials and improved methodologies that the connection between Melissa Grant and Daniel Hargrove could be established with confidence. This aspect of the case has broader implications for the field of forensic investigation, illustrating how cases once considered static can be reactivated through the application of new techniques. It reinforces the importance of maintaining evidence integrity over long periods and highlights the potential for future developments to further enhance the ability to analyze historical cases. However, even as the report underscored these advancements, it also maintained a careful balance between certainty and restraint. The conclusions drawn were supported by the available evidence, but presented with acknowledgement of the analytical limits that remain. Because in the end, the purpose of the investigation was not only to identify, but to document, to verify, and to present a clear account of what could be established with confidence. And in Melissa Grant's case, that account reached a point of convergence where multiple independent lines of evidence aligned to support a single conclusion, while still leaving certain aspects of the narrative open to interpretation. The result is a case that stands as both resolved and incomplete in different dimensions, resolved in terms of identification and evidentiary linkage, yet incomplete in terms of fully reconstructing the lived reality of the moments that defined its outcome. As the final report was prepared for archival, the materials were organized, labeled, and stored in accordance with procedural guidelines, ensuring that the case file would remain accessible for future reference if needed. And with that, the investigation transitioned from active analysis into documented history, preserved not only as a record of a single case, but as an example of how time, technology, and evidence can intersect to bring clarity to events that once existed only in uncertainty, even as some elements of those events remain permanently beyond reach. As the case transitioned into its final archival state, attention did not immediately fade. Instead, it shifted outward, away from the mechanics of evidence and toward the human impact that lingered long after the technical conclusions had been reached, because in cold cases, resolution is not a single moment, but a ripple that extends across families, communities, and memories that have been shaped by years of unanswered questions. For Melissa Grant's family, the notification came with a mixture of clarity and emotional weight that had no simple resolution. After decades of uncertainty, the identification of Daniel Hargrove provided a name to anchor the narrative of what had happened, transforming an abstract absence into a defined, albeit distant, reality. The years of waiting, of revisiting old conversations, of holding onto incomplete information, culminated in a single confirmation that recontextualized everything that had come before. But that confirmation did not erase the intervening years. Grief, in this context, had already evolved. It had shifted from immediate shock into something quieter, more persistent, shaped by the passage of time and the gradual acceptance of unanswered questions. The introduction of a name did not reverse that process. Instead, it added a layer of understanding that allowed for a more complete acknowledgement of what had been lost. In interviews conducted following the release of the findings, family members expressed a range of reactions that reflected both relief and a renewed sense of connection to Melissa's memory. The identification of the individual responsible allowed them to reframe the story of her disappearance, not as an unresolved mystery, but as an event with a documented source, even if the full circumstances remained partially unknown. This distinction between knowing who and understanding how became central to how the outcome was interpreted by those closest to her. Within the broader community, the case resurfaced in public discourse as news outlets revisited the details of the original disappearance alongside the modern breakthrough. Headlines that once reported on a missing person were now replaced with updates that confirmed a resolution, drawing attention to the role of forensic advancements in reopening and solving long-dormant investigations. Residents of the neighborhoods surrounding Discovery Park, as well as those familiar with the area from the early 1990s, reflected on the case with a renewed sense of awareness. For some, the realization that the location where Melissa's body was found had remained part of their daily environment for years added an unsettling dimension to their understanding of the space. Trails that had once been seen as ordinary walking paths were now viewed through the lens of history, carrying the memory of an event that had remained hidden for decades. This shift in perception is a common effect in cases that are resolved long after their occurrence. Physical locations become associated not only with their present function, but with the events that took place within them, creating a layered sense of meaning that blends the past with the present. Investigators, too, reflected on the case from a professional standpoint. For those who had worked on the original investigation in the 1990s, the reopening of the case represented both a continuation and a revision of their earlier efforts. While the tools available at the time had been applied to the best of their capabilities, the limitations they faced were now clearly defined by comparison to modern techniques. The individuals who had initially worked on Melissa's case had operated without the benefit of genetic genealogy, advanced DNA sequencing, or the expansive databases that now support contemporary investigations. Their reliance on interviews, physical evidence, and observational data was consistent with the standards of the time, and the absence of a resolution was not due to oversight, but to the constraints under which they were working. In reviewing the case decades later, current investigators acknowledged the foundational work that had preserved the evidence and maintained the integrity of the file, allowing it to be revisited with new methodologies. Without that preservation, the opportunity for identification would not have existed. This interplay between past and present highlights an important aspect of forensic work, that progress is cumulative, built upon the efforts of earlier investigations, even when those efforts do not immediately yield results. As the findings were finalized and shared through official channels, the case became part of a broader pattern of cold cases that have been resolved through similar means. Across multiple jurisdictions, cases once considered closed due to lack of leads have been reopened and successfully analyzed using advancements in DNA technology and genealogical research. Melissa Grant's case contributed to this evolving body of examples, demonstrating how evidence preserved in one era can be reinterpreted in another, producing outcomes that were previously unattainable. At the same time, the case also served as a reminder of the enduring limits that remain in investigative work. While technology can identify individuals and confirm connections, it cannot recover experiences that were never recorded, nor can it reconstruct subjective perspectives that were never documented. The internal thoughts, motivations, and decisions that led to a specific outcome remain accessible only through indirect inference, unless directly expressed by the individual responsible. In the absence of such direct expression, the narrative of the case is constructed through observable data points, each contributing to a framework that approximates what may have occurred, but does not fully encapsulate it. This distinction is particularly important when considering cases that are resolved posthumously, where the individual identified as responsible is no longer available to provide testimony or clarification. In these situations, the findings are necessarily based on evidence that can be independently verified, rather than personal accounts that could provide additional context. Daniel Hargrove's death in 2011 effectively closed the possibility of obtaining direct insight into his perspective. As a result, the conclusions drawn in the case remain grounded in physical evidence, documented records, and corroborated analysis, rather than statements or admissions. This limitation does not diminish the validity of the findings, but it does define their scope. Within that scope, the case achieves a high degree of certainty regarding identity and contact, supported by multiple independent forms of evidence. However, beyond those points, the narrative transitions into an area where interpretation must be applied carefully and where definitive answers may remain out of reach. In the context of public understanding, this balance between certainty and uncertainty often shapes how resolved cold cases are perceived. On one hand, there is closure in knowing that an individual has been identified and that a connection has been established. On the other hand, there is an awareness that the full story, in all its complexity, cannot be entirely reconstructed. This duality is reflected in how such cases are discussed in media, academic analysis, and community reflection. They are presented not only as solved mysteries, but as examples of both the capabilities and limitations of modern investigative science. For those studying forensic methodologies, Melissa Grant's case offers insight into the practical application of genetic genealogy, the importance of evidence preservation, and the processes involved in validating findings across multiple disciplines. For those more broadly interested in criminal investigations, it illustrates how cases can evolve over time, moving from unresolved to resolved as new tools become available. And for those personally connected to the individuals involved, the case represents something more immediate and tangible, a moment where uncertainty gives way to understanding, even if that understanding arrives years later than expected. As the archival process was completed, the case file was formally categorized, stored, and indexed for future reference. It became part of a larger repository of cases that document not only individual events, but the progression of investigative practices over time. In that sense, the case exists on multiple levels simultaneously. It is a record of a specific incident, a demonstration of forensic advancement, and a reflection of the evolving relationship between evidence, technology, and interpretation. Yet, even as it is preserved in documentation, the human element remains at its core. A life interrupted, a community affected, a question that persisted for decades before finally being answered through methods that did not exist at the time the question was first asked. And in the quiet spaces between those timelines, the memory of Melissa Grant remains, not only as part of a resolved case file, but as a reminder of the individuals behind each entry, each report, each piece of evidence that contributes to a story that is ultimately larger than the documents that describe it. As the case settled into its place within the archive, attention gradually drifted from the immediate findings and toward the deeper implications that extended beyond a single investigation, because what had unfolded in Melissa Grant's case was not just the resolution of one disappearance. but a demonstration of how time can transform evidence that once seemed inert into something capable of revealing connections that were previously invisible, and that transformation carries consequences not only for the individuals directly involved, but for the broader understanding of how cold cases exist within the framework of modern law enforcement. In the years following the identification, analysts and investigators who were familiar with the case began to reference it as a point of study when discussing the effectiveness of genetic genealogy in solving long-dormant cases. The methodology itself had already been applied in other investigations, but each case contributes unique insights into how the process can be refined, improved, and adapted to different types of evidence and circumstances. Melissa Grant's case was particularly notable because the initial evidence, a biological sample recovered from beneath fingernails, had been preserved for nearly 3 decades before being reanalyzed with techniques that did not exist at the time of collection. This extended timeline highlighted the importance of maintaining evidence integrity over long periods, even when immediate analytical capabilities are limited. The decision to preserve rather than discard or exhaust the sample proved critical. At the time of the original investigation, there was no clear indication that future technology would enable a more detailed analysis of such material. Yet the protocols in place ensured that the sample remained available for future use, demonstrating a forward-looking approach that, while standard in procedure, yielded significant results in retrospect. This aspect of the case reinforced a principle that has become increasingly relevant in forensic science: the value of preservation not only for current analysis, but for potential future applications. As technologies continue to evolve, materials collected today may serve purposes that are not yet fully understood, making long-term storage and proper documentation essential components of investigative practice. At the same time, the case also underscored the limitations of relying solely on technological advancement to solve unresolved cases. While the introduction of genetic genealogy provided the key to identifying Daniel Hargrove, the process still depended on the existence of preserved evidence, accurate records, and the ability to trace genetic connections through publicly available data. Without any one of these elements, the outcome might have been different. This interplay between technology and foundational investigative practices illustrates that breakthroughs are rarely the result of a single factor. Instead, they emerge from the alignment of multiple conditions: preserved evidence, methodological innovation, and the availability of data that can be used to establish connections across time and distance. In Melissa's case, all of these elements converged, allowing investigators to move from an unidentified DNA profile to a specific individual whose identity could be confirmed through independent verification. Following the resolution of the case, discussions within investigative and forensic communities often turn to the broader implications of using genealogical databases in criminal investigations. While the effectiveness of the technique is well established, it also raises considerations related to privacy, data usage, and the ethical boundaries of accessing and analyzing genetic information that is originally submitted for non-investigative purposes. These discussions are ongoing, and they reflect the evolving relationship between public data and law enforcement applications. In cases like Melissa Grant's, where the data ultimately contributed to the identification of a suspect in a serious crime, the use of such methods is viewed as a valuable tool. However, it also prompts continued evaluation of guidelines and policies to ensure that the balance between investigative utility and individual privacy is maintained. Within the context of this case, the genealogical analysis was conducted in accordance with established protocols, and the resulting findings were verified through multiple layers of confirmation before being accepted as part of the final identification process. Another dimension that emerged from the case was the impact of time on both evidence and perception. Over the course of nearly 30 years, the original investigation had transitioned from an active inquiry into a historical record, with each passing year adding distance between the event and those who were directly involved in its aftermath. This passage of time influenced not only the availability of witnesses and memories, but also the way the case was understood within the community. As new generations became familiar with the area where Melissa was found, the original context of the case gradually became less immediate, replaced by a more abstract awareness of its existence as a cold case rather than a current concern. The reopening of the case reintroduced that context, bringing attention back to details that had been largely dormant in public awareness. News coverage, retrospective analysis, and discussions within the community contributed to a renewed understanding of the event, now framed within the context of its resolution. For those studying patterns in cold case resolutions, this dynamic is significant. It demonstrates how cases can re-enter public consciousness when new information becomes available, and how that renewed attention can influence both perception and engagement with a case. From an investigative standpoint, the case also reinforced the importance of interagency cooperation and data sharing. The ability to compare DNA profiles across databases, to access genealogical records, and to coordinate between forensic laboratories and investigative teams was essential in building the chain of evidence that led to the identification of Daniel Hargrove. Each component of the process contributed to a larger system in which information flows between different sources, allowing for connections to be made that would not be possible within isolated datasets. This interconnected approach reflects the modern landscape of forensic investigation, where collaboration and data integration play key roles in achieving results. As the findings from the case were reviewed and documented, they were also incorporated into training materials and case studies used to educate new investigators. These materials highlight not only the successful outcome, but the process by which that outcome was achieved, including the steps taken to verify evidence, the methods used to construct genealogical links, and the considerations involved in interpreting circumstantial data alongside forensic results. In this way, Melissa Grant's case contributes to the ongoing development of investigative knowledge, serving as an example that can inform future work in similar cases. Despite the technical focus of these analyses, the human element remains central. Each case represents an individual life, a series of events that had real consequences for those involved, and a network of relationships that extend beyond the immediate scope of the investigation. In Melissa's case, the resolution provided a form of closure that had been absent for many years, allowing those connected to her to place the events of her disappearance within a defined context. While it does not alter the outcome, it does change the way that outcome is understood, replacing uncertainty with information that, while incomplete in some respects, is nevertheless significant. For investigators, the case represents both a success and a reminder. A success in that it demonstrates the ability to resolve long-standing cases through the application of modern techniques. A reminder in that even with advanced tools, there remain aspects of each case that cannot be fully recovered or reconstructed. The balance between these two perspectives is what defines the field of cold case investigation. It is a discipline that operates at the intersection of science, history, and human experience, where each case contributes to a broader understanding of what is possible and what remains beyond reach. As Melissa Grant's case is referenced in discussions, reports, and analyses, it continues to serve as an example of how evidence preserved over time can yield results that were not achievable at the moment of its collection. It also illustrates the importance of maintaining meticulous records, preserving physical materials, and remaining open to the possibility that future developments may provide answers that are not currently accessible. In the end, the case stands as a reflection of both continuity and change. Continuity in the sense that the evidence collected in 1993 remained relevant decades later, and change in the sense that new technologies allowed that evidence to be interpreted in ways that were not previously possible. And within that intersection lies the essence of cold case investigation, the understanding that time does not erase evidence, but rather, in certain circumstances, reveals it in a new form, allowing questions that once seemed unanswerable to finally find resolution. Even as some aspects of those questions remain, by their nature, partially beyond the reach of complete explanation. As the investigation reached its final documented stage, the narrative surrounding Melissa Grant's case began to shift from one of pursuit to one of reflection, not because the answers had fully resolved every lingering uncertainty, but because the central question that had defined the case for decades, who was responsible, had been addressed with a level of certainty that allowed the focus to move toward understanding the broader context in which the events had occurred, and how those events fit into the evolving landscape of forensic science and criminal investigation. The identification of Daniel Hargrove through genetic genealogy marked a definitive turning point, yet even after that breakthrough, investigators continued to revisit the case file, not in search of new suspects, but to examine the sequence of decisions, evidence handling, and procedural steps that had ultimately enabled the resolution. This reflective analysis is a standard practice in resolved cold cases, as it allows agencies to evaluate the effectiveness of their methods and identify elements that contributed to the outcome. In doing so, investigators paid particular attention to the continuity of the evidence chain, recognizing that the integrity of the biological samples collected in 1993 had been preserved through careful documentation, controlled storage conditions, and adherence to protocols that ensured the sample remained viable for future analysis. Without these factors, the genetic material may have degraded to the point where modern testing would not have been possible. The case also highlighted the role of incremental advancements in forensic technology. While genetic genealogy is often viewed as a single breakthrough, it is in fact the result of a series of developments that occurred over time, including improvements in DNA extraction techniques, sequencing accuracy, and the expansion of publicly accessible genealogical databases. Each of these developments contributed to a framework that allowed investigators to move from an unknown DNA profile to a narrowed list of potential familial connections, and ultimately to a specific individual whose identity could be confirmed. This layered progression reflects a broader truth within forensic science, that breakthroughs are rarely instantaneous. Instead, they emerge from a cumulative process in which each advancement builds upon the last, gradually increasing the ability to interpret and utilize evidence in more precise ways. In Melissa Grant's case, the convergence of these advancements allowed a biological trace that had remained unidentifiable for decades to be matched through indirect genetic relationships, demonstrating how distant familial connections can serve as pathways to identification when direct matches are not available. At the same time, the case reinforced the importance of cross-referencing multiple sources of information. While the genetic data provided the foundation for identification, it was not used in isolation. Investigators corroborated the findings through additional records, historical data, and contextual analysis to ensure that the conclusion was supported by independent lines of evidence. This multi-layered verification process is essential in maintaining the reliability of conclusions drawn from forensic analysis. It ensures that findings are not dependent on a single dataset, but are instead supported by a network of evidence that collectively establishes a high degree of confidence. As the findings were finalized, the case transitioned into a phase where its primary function was no longer investigative, but archival and educational. The documentation associated with the case was organized into a format that could be referenced by future investigators, researchers, and analysts seeking to understand the application of genetic genealogy in a real-world context. Within these records, detailed notes were preserved regarding the methods used, the challenges encountered, and the steps taken to verify the identity of the individual involved. These notes serve as a resource for training and reference, providing insight into both the technical and procedural aspects of the investigation. Beyond its technical significance, the case also contributed to ongoing discussions about the ethical considerations associated with genetic data. As more investigations begin to incorporate genealogical databases, questions regarding consent, data ownership, and the appropriate use of publicly submitted information continue to be examined by legal experts, policymakers, and forensic professionals. In this context, Melissa Grant's case is often cited as an example of how such data can be used to resolve serious crimes, while also prompting careful consideration of the frameworks that govern its use. These discussions are part of a broader effort to establish guidelines that balance investigative effectiveness with respect for individual privacy and autonomy. Meanwhile, within the community where the case originated, the resolution prompted a period of reflection that extended beyond the specifics of the investigation. Residents who had lived in the area during the 1990s revisited their memories of the time, recalling the atmosphere of uncertainty that surrounded the disappearance and the way it had been discussed in local conversations and media coverage. For newer residents, the case represented a historical event that had now been resolved, offering a perspective that differed from those who had experienced the case as an ongoing concern. This generational difference in perception is a common phenomenon in cold cases that are resolved after many years, as the passage of time naturally separates the original event from its later interpretation. In media coverage following the announcement of the identification, emphasis was placed not only on the outcome, but also on the process by which the outcome was achieved. Reports often highlighted the role of advanced DNA analysis, the cooperation between investigative teams, and the persistence required to revisit a case that had remained unsolved for decades. These narratives contributed to a broader public understanding of how cold cases can be addressed using modern techniques, and they helped to contextualize the resolution within a larger pattern of similar cases that have been solved through the application of genetic genealogy. For those studying the evolution of forensic investigation, the case serves as a reference point that illustrates the transition from traditional methods of identification to more technologically advanced approaches. It demonstrates how the integration of scientific innovation into investigative practice can produce results that were previously unattainable while also maintaining continuity with established principles of evidence handling and analysis. As the case file remains archived, it continues to be accessible for review, ensuring that its contents can inform future work and contribute to ongoing research. The preservation of both physical evidence and documented analysis allows the case to remain relevant, even after its primary investigative purpose has been fulfilled. And yet, despite the technical closure achieved through identification and verification, the case retains an enduring presence that extends beyond its documentation. It exists as a reminder of the complexities involved in resolving long-standing investigations, the limitations inherent in any single moment of analysis, and the ways in which time can both obscure and reveal the truth. Melissa Grant's case, once defined by absence and uncertainty, now occupies a space defined by understanding and reflection, not because every detail has been fully uncovered, but because the central thread that guided the investigation has been followed to a conclusion supported by evidence, analysis, and verification. In that conclusion lies the final transition of the case, from an unresolved mystery that persisted across decades to a documented account that can be studied, referenced, and understood within the broader context of forensic science and investigative practice, even as certain aspects remain, by necessity, beyond the complete reach of reconstruction, preserved instead in the quiet spaces where evidence ends and interpretation begins. As the final layer of documentation was filed and the investigation formally moved into its completed state, what remained was no longer a pursuit of answers, but the quiet aftershock of resolution. The subtle but persistent realization that a question which had endured for decades had finally been answered through methods that did not exist when the question first emerged, and in that contrast between then and now, the case took on a meaning that extended beyond its own timeline, becoming part of a broader narrative about time, technology, and the limits of human understanding. The closure of Melissa Grant's case did not arrive as a singular dramatic moment, but rather as a convergence of findings that, when aligned, formed a coherent and verifiable conclusion, each element reinforcing the others until the uncertainty that had once defined the investigation was replaced by a structured account supported by forensic evidence, genealogical analysis, and corroborated records. This convergence is what distinguishes resolved cold cases from ongoing investigations, not the absence of complexity, but the presence of enough consistent data points to reduce ambiguity to a level that can be confidently interpreted. Yet even within that confidence, the case retains an inherent duality, because while the identity of the individual connected to the evidence has been established, the full internal narrative of the events remains partially inaccessible, shaped by decisions, interactions, and circumstances that were never fully recorded. This is a common boundary in investigative work, where physical evidence can confirm presence, contact, and biological linkage, but cannot fully reconstruct intent or subjective experience without direct testimony. In the absence of such testimony, investigators rely on patterns, probabilities, and contextual indicators to build a framework that explains what is known while acknowledging what cannot be definitively proven. This framework is not speculative in the casual sense, but analytical, grounded in the careful interpretation of available data and constrained by the requirement that each conclusion must be supported by verifiable evidence. Within Melissa Grant's case, this approach allowed investigators to establish a timeline that aligned physical findings with documented records to identify a likely sequence of events based on the location and condition of the evidence, and to connect those findings to an individual whose DNA profile matched the material recovered at the scene. Each step in this process was subjected to verification, ensuring that the final conclusion was not dependent on a single point of failure, but on a network of mutually reinforcing observations. As the case transitioned fully into its archival phase, its role shifted from active investigation to enduring reference, becoming part of a collection of resolved cases that together illustrate the evolution of forensic methodologies over time. In this context, the case is not isolated, but interconnected with others that have followed similar paths, each contributing to a growing body of knowledge that informs future investigations. For practitioners in the field, this body of cases serves as both a resource and a guide, offering insight into how evidence can be preserved, how analytical techniques can be applied, and how interdisciplinary collaboration can produce results that would not be achievable within a single domain. The integration of biology, data science, genealogy, and traditional investigative work reflects a modern approach that depends on the alignment of multiple disciplines. At the same time, the case also stands as a reminder of the individuals behind the data. Each piece of evidence corresponds to a moment in time, each record to a decision or observation, and each conclusion to a process that involved human judgment at multiple stages. The technical aspects of the case, while essential, exist alongside the human elements that give the investigation its significance. In the community connected to the case, the resolution allowed for a recontextualization of events that had remained unresolved for years. What was once an open question became a closed chapter, not in the sense that all aspects were fully explained, but in the sense that the primary unknown had been addressed in a way that allowed for a coherent understanding of the outcome. This understanding does not erase the past, nor does it alter the events that occurred, but it provides a framework through which those events can be interpreted with greater clarity. For those who followed the case over time, this shift represents a transition from uncertainty to acknowledgement, from speculation to evidence-based conclusion. Within the broader landscape of cold case investigations, Melissa Grant's case contributes to a pattern that demonstrates how advancements in technology can intersect with preserved evidence to produce outcomes that were previously unattainable. It illustrates the importance of maintaining long-term records, investing in archival systems, and remaining open to the possibility that future developments may unlock answers that are not currently accessible. It also highlights the limitations that remain inherent in any investigative process. While identification can be achieved and connections can be established, there are aspects of each case that resist complete reconstruction, particularly those that depend on subjective experience or undocumented interactions. These limitations are not failures of the process, but characteristics of the types of information available. In this sense, the resolution of the case is both definitive and incomplete, definitive in its identification of key elements and incomplete in its inability to fully reconstruct every dimension of the events it describes. This balance is a defining feature of resolved cold cases, where certainty and uncertainty coexist within a structured understanding of the available evidence. As the final records are stored and the case is cataloged for future reference, it becomes part of a larger continuum, one that spans decades of investigative work and reflects the gradual progression of methods, tools, and techniques used to address unresolved questions. Each case within this continuum adds to a collective understanding, shaping how future cases are approached and how evidence is interpreted. Melissa Grant's case, in particular, stands as an example of how persistence, preservation, and technological advancement can align to produce a resolution that bridges the gap between past and present. It demonstrates that even after many years, evidence can retain its relevance, and that questions once considered beyond reach can, under the right conditions, be answered with a degree of certainty that brings clarity to a long-standing mystery. And as the final page of the case file is effectively turned, what remains is not the pursuit of what is missing, but the recognition of what has been established, a conclusion supported by analysis, confirmed through verification, and preserved within the records that ensure the case will remain accessible for study, reflection, and understanding, long after the moment of its resolution has passed, continuing to exist not as an open question, but as a completed narrative within the ever-evolving history of forensic investigation. Even as the case entered its most settled phase, the implications of its resolution continued to unfold in quieter, less visible ways, not through new developments in the investigation itself, but through the influence it exerted on how similar cases might be approached in the future. Because each resolved cold case becomes more than an endpoint, it becomes a reference point, a working example that informs decisions made in investigations that are still ongoing, still incomplete, still searching for the kind of clarity that Melissa Grant's case ultimately achieved. Within forensic laboratories, the case was examined not for its outcome alone, but for the sequence of technical steps that allowed that outcome to emerge. Analysts reviewed how the biological sample had been handled, how it had been stored, and how its integrity was maintained over time. These details matter because they define the conditions under which future evidence must be preserved if it is to remain viable for reanalysis decades later. The success of the genetic testing in this case reinforced the principle that even when immediate results are not possible, proper preservation ensures that future possibilities remain open. At the procedural level, investigators also considered how the reopening of the case was initiated. It was not triggered by a new witness or a sudden confession, but by the decision to re-examine archived evidence using tools that had become available through scientific progress. This decision reflects an important aspect of modern investigative strategy, the periodic review of cold case files to determine whether advancements in technology or methodology might yield new insights. Such reviews are not always guaranteed to produce results, but they are essential in maintaining the potential for resolution. In many cases, the difference between a permanently unsolved case and one that is eventually resolved lies in whether the evidence is revisited with fresh capabilities at the right time. In Melissa Grant's case, that timing aligned with the maturity of genetic genealogy as a reliable investigative tool, as well as the availability of databases and analytical frameworks capable of supporting indirect identification. Without these elements reaching a sufficient level of development, the evidence might have remained uninterpretable, regardless of its preservation. This intersection of timing and technology is one of the defining characteristics of cold case resolutions. It illustrates that the passage of time, while often associated with the loss of information, can also coincide with the emergence of new methods that transform previously unusable data into actionable evidence. As the case continued to be discussed within professional circles, it was often referenced in training environments as an example of how to approach evidence with a long-term perspective. Trainees were encouraged to consider not only what could be done with evidence in the present, but what might be possible in the future, emphasizing the importance of maintaining standards that allow for adaptability over time. This forward-looking mindset is reflected in several aspects of a case, particularly in the way the original investigators documented their findings. Detailed records, consistent labeling, and careful cataloging ensured that the evidence could be located, identified, and accessed without ambiguity when the case was revisited decades later. These practices, while routine, proved essential in enabling the continuity required for successful reanalysis. Beyond the technical and procedural dimensions, the case also contributed to a broader cultural understanding of how cold cases are perceived. Public awareness of forensic capabilities has increased over time, partly due to high-profile cases that demonstrate the potential of DNA analysis and genealogical tracing. Melissa Grant's case fits within this context, illustrating how a combination of science and persistence can bring resolution to investigations that once seemed unsolvable. However, this increased awareness also brings with it a more nuanced understanding of what resolution actually means. In public discourse, a solved case is often associated with a sense of closure, but within the investigative field, resolution is more precisely defined as the establishment of a supported conclusion based on available evidence. This conclusion addresses the primary questions of identity and connection, but does not necessarily resolve every aspect of the underlying narrative. In Melissa Grant's case, the identification of Daniel Hargrove answered the central question of who is connected to the evidence, but the broader context surrounding the events remains partially inferred. This distinction is important, as it highlights the difference between confirmation and reconstruction, between establishing a link and fully reconstructing a sequence of events in its entirety. For those analyzing the case from a methodological perspective, this limitation does not diminish the significance of the outcome. Instead, it serves as a reminder that investigative conclusions are built upon the best available evidence, interpreted through established frameworks and validated through multiple sources of verification. The strength of the conclusion lies not in its completeness, but in its consistency across independent lines of analysis. As the case is preserved in archives, it remains accessible for ongoing review, allowing future investigators and researchers to revisit its findings in light of new developments that may arise. This accessibility ensures that the case continues to contribute to the collective knowledge base, even after its primary investigative objectives have been achieved. In this way, Melissa Grant's case exists as both a resolved investigation and a continuing reference, a fixed point within a dynamic field that continues to evolve as new tools, techniques, and methodologies are introduced. And while the specifics of the case are tied to a particular time, place, and set of circumstances, the principles that guided its resolution extend beyond those boundaries. The importance of preservation, the value of documentation, the role of interdisciplinary collaboration, and the impact of technological advancement are all elements that apply broadly across the field of forensic investigation. Each of these elements played a role in transforming a decades-old unsolved case into one that could be understood with a level of clarity that was not possible at the time of its origin. As a result, the case stands not only as a completed investigation, but as a demonstration of what becomes possible when information is preserved, methods are refined, and time is allowed to bring together the conditions necessary for resolution. And in the quiet continuity of its archived records, the case remains present, not as an active inquiry, but as a concluded narrative that continues to inform, to illustrate, and to remind those who encounter it that even the most enduring uncertainties can, under the right circumstances, yield to the combined forces of persistence, evidence, and progress, revealing answers that were always embedded within the traces left behind, waiting for the moment when the tools to uncover them would finally exist. As the case's presence faded further from active discussion and settled more firmly into archival reference, its significance began to manifest less through immediate attention and more through its quiet integration into the collective methodology of modern forensic practice, where resolved investigations are not simply closed files, but evolving case studies that continue to influence how similar situations are approached, analyzed, and understood across different jurisdictions and disciplines. Within investigative units, Melissa Grant's case was often revisited during internal reviews focused on cold case strategy, particularly in discussions centered on prioritization. Not every unsolved case can be reopened at once, and resources must be allocated based on a combination of factors, including the availability of preserved evidence, the likelihood of obtaining usable DNA, and the presence of identifiable leads that can be pursued using current technologies. In this context, cases like Melissa's serve as benchmarks, demonstrating how certain types of evidence, when preserved correctly, can yield results even after extended periods of inactivity. The identification achieved in this case reinforced a key operational insight that biological evidence, even in small or initially inconclusive quantities, can retain value far beyond its original intended use. This understanding has influenced how evidence is categorized, stored, and reevaluated, encouraging a broader perspective on what constitutes viable material for future analysis. In parallel, forensic laboratories have increasingly adopted protocols that account for long-term usability. These include enhanced storage conditions, detailed metadata tracking, and improved cataloging systems that allow evidence to be located and retrieved efficiently, even after many years. The success of cases resolved through genetic genealogy has validated these practices, demonstrating that careful preservation can directly contribute to eventual breakthroughs. Beyond laboratory procedures, the case also had an impact on how investigative timelines are perceived. Traditional investigations often operate under the assumption that leads must be pursued within a relatively short window of time, after which opportunities may diminish. However, the resolution of Melissa Grant's case challenges that assumption by showing that investigations can remain viable across decades, provided that evidence and records are maintained in a way that allows for re-engagement when new methods become available. This shift in perspective has encouraged agencies to maintain active databases of cold cases, with periodic reviews designed to identify cases that may benefit from reanalysis. These reviews are not random. They are guided by criteria that assess the presence of physical evidence, the completeness of documentation, and the potential compatibility with emerging technologies. In Melissa's case, the alignment of these factors created an opportunity that was recognized and acted upon, leading to the decision to re-examine the preserved biological sample using updated genetic techniques. This decision, while procedural in nature, ultimately proved to be the catalyst for resolution. As the findings were disseminated through professional channels, the case became part of a growing collection of examples used to illustrate the practical application of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. These examples are studied not only for their outcomes, but for the processes they represent, including how data is interpreted, how matches are validated, and how indirect connections can be traced through shared ancestry. This approach requires a combination of scientific analysis and genealogical research, blending disciplines that were once largely separate into a